Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we look at a member of my classic computer collection. Now this particular computer has been the subject of one of my earlier videos. That video was low resolution and the sound wasn't very good. I was really just learning the craft at that stage. But the machine is a classic and I think it deserves better than a crummy video. So I've decided to make another one, this time in high definition. So I give you the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1. Let's take a look at it.
In the mid-1970s, getting your hot little hands on a personal computer like this Altar, even one you owned yourself, wasn't easy. Usually, procurement was by mail order. It involved a long wait and, more often than not, you had to get someone to assemble it. Either the company you bought it from prior to them shipping, or you personally. The people that had the skills to do this, let alone get anything running on these micro machines, were a small band of electronics enthusiasts inhabiting garages and workshops. 1977 changed all that. This was the year that saw 3 consumer microcomputers released into the market. These were computers that you could buy, pre-assembled, often over a store counter, computers which you could just plug in and go. These models are often referred to as the 1977 Trinity, and they consist of the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 1. All are significant in their own right, but it's this last machine we focus on in this video. The TRS-80 Model 1 was developed and released by Tandy Corporation and distributed through their extensive network of 3,000 Radio Shack stores in North America and elsewhere. These stores sold all types of electronic gadgets, kits and components to the electronic enthusiast and general public. The computer almost didn't happen. Don French, a buyer for Tandy, had purchased his own Altar and could see the potential of microcomputers. He drafted a design of his own and then convinced the president of manufacturing, John Roach, to hire an engineer. This man, Steve Leininger, to take the concept further. French and Leininger faced a lot of management resistance to the project, but eventually they won through. The result was the Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 1. The TRS stands for Tandy Radio Shack, and the 80 was a nod to the Z80 processor, which was at the heart of the machine. The first units were pretty Spartan, only 4K of RAM with a stripped-down version of BASIC. Later this Level 1 BASIC was replaced with a far more capable 12K Level 2 BASIC from Microsoft. The memory was also boosted to 16K, and the keyboard started to sport a numeric keypad. Entry-level configurations were cassette only, but expansion capabilities soon followed, giving more memory and allowing disk drives and a printer to be attached. The cassette-based machine was a low price, and it came with everything, including a screen, unlike, say, the Apple II. Cheap as they were for a computer, they were still the most expensive things in Radio Shack stores. Tandy weren't expecting sharp sales. After all, what could people do with a cassette-based home computer? And why would they want one? Such was the low expectation of this new gadget, which didn't seem to have any obvious use. Tandy initially only made 3,500 machines, enough so the computer could be used in the stores for inventory if nobody bought them. As it turns out, the company sold over 10,000 TRS-80 Model 1s in its first 1.5 months of sales, and over 200,000 during the product's lifetime. Indeed, from the years 1977 to 1980, helped no doubt by their existing manufacturing and distribution systems, Tandy sold way more microcomputers than Apple and Commodore combined. So let's leave the history and have a look at my own machine. And here it is. It's in beautiful condition, almost museum condition. It's one of the later models in that it's got the numeric keypad, but we'll just do a fly over the keyboard here. You can see the label up the top there. Its colour scheme is referred to as Battleship Grey. Here's a side view. You can see it's eagled there for easy typing. And here are some DIN plugs around the back. From left to right, we've got one for the cassette recorder, the video, and the power. You notice how those DIN plugs are all the same. you can see how it would be very easy, say, to plug the power into the video socket with the resulting grief. Under this flap we have an expansion card edge. This caused a lot of grief for TRS-80 Model 1 owners. Not with the initial console, but if you wanted to add disk capability and more RAM. To do that, you needed to plug in an expansion unit using this card edge. Now the problem was that this card edge tended to oxidize. Now the expansion unit held some of the RAM, as well as of course the disk controller and printer lines. So it had address lines and data lines running through this card edge, and the smallest amount of oxidation would interrupt that flow and cause what is known as a spontaneous reboot, where suddenly the computer would reboot itself. It was a real issue, and in fact there were third-party products you could buy, gold-plated card edges that you could solder onto these cheaper card edges to stop that sort of problem happening. It's a problem that wasn't as serious in the Apple II or Commodore PET, because there all of their memory was on the motherboard, rather than accessing part of it through a card edge. Here's a shot of the computer with its cover off. This is actually my second Model 1. I've got two of them, and this is the one I use for spares. The main board's actually flipped, so the keyboard sits on the bottom of the circuit board and the components are on the other side. Here's the layout of the board. It's a pretty simple design. There's only room for 16 kilobytes of memory on the board itself, so unless you modify it, the other memory, or extra memory, has to be accessed by the expansion unit through that troublesome card edge, which I spoke about before. So here's the Model 1 in its most basic configuration. You can see there the Model 1 screen, which is an integral part of the computer, so you bought it when you got the unit, although any composite monitor does work with the Model 1 console. This is not a Tandy tape recorder, but it is one that I got with a computer of similar vintage, and it's designed specifically to load and play tapes containing computer programs. So now let's turn on this cassette base unit so that you can see what an excited buyer in the late 70s would have seen when they turned on their TRS-80 Model 1. Small power switch down there by the DIN plugs, which I just pushed. And there you see a small question saying mem size, which allows you to reserve a little bit of top memory if you need it for a small program. And pushing enter shows the fact that we're now in Radio Shack Level 2 Basic, which is actually Microsoft Basic. For those of you not familiar with these older computers, it was very common, if it wasn't a disk-based unit, to simply fall into Basic when you turn the machine on. The Basic was housed in ROM. So there you can see I've just asked it to print the memory, show us how much memory it's got, and it's got just under 16K. So now it's waiting for us to tell it what to do, and in the day you normally would have loaded a program from tape or done some programming yourself. And there are a couple of ways you can load programs from tape on a TRS-80 Model 1 depending on exactly what the program is. If it's a machine code program, so if it's simply written in binary, you use the different technique for loading than if it was in BASIC. So we're going to load a program, and it's a machine language program, so we use the system command just by putting in system. You get a little star, then you push return, the tapes whir around, and your program starts to load in. And you can tell it's loading in by those blinking asterisks, as you can see up there in the top right. Now, loading usually took a long time if it was a substantial program, so we're talking about 5 to 10 minutes. Could take ages. I've used the power of video to cut down that excruciating wait for you, and we're now ready to load our program. It's a game, it's Sea Dragon. And as you can see, the Model 1 does have graphics. These graphics were often criticised in the day for being chunky and blocky, and in fact they weren't as fine as the Commodore PETs or the Apple graphics. But that really didn't matter. The gameplay was still very, very good. Oops, I'm in trouble here. No colour, of course. That came into home microcomputers a little later. Now, just going to load a basic program, and you can see I've used a different command there. I've used cload, which stands for cassette load. Again, through the power of video editing, I've shortened this. It's a long program, and I'll break the listing so that you can see it. But this is another favourite game of mine. This is Star Trek, and it does utilise some of the graphics of the TRS-80. So you can see there's me in the Enterprise. I'm represented by an E, and there's a Klingon down on the left, represented by a K. I'm just about to fire at him with my photon torpedo. Got to try and calculate the angle, and there we go. Gotcha. So even slow basic games could be quite playable. Or rather than loading programs and playing games, you could do some programming. Keyboard's very responsive. It's got a nice feel to it. You can type quite quickly. The BASIC was also very powerful for its day, with a lot of good commands for manipulating strings. Right, this rather chunky looking object is the expansion unit. It's not pretty to look at, but it is designed for the screen to sit on top of, and you can see those slots in the top. They fit the feet of the screen, so it sits there quite nicely. It has a lot of card edges that are covered with these plastic covers, in this case. You can see the RS-2321 there on the right, and this one is connected to a cable which in turn connects to the TRS-80 Model 1 console through that card edge that I mentioned earlier. Coming around the side, we've got other card edges, one for expansion, and there's one here for the printer. It's a Centronics parallel printer port. Just under this cover, pull it away, you can see the card edge there. So a cable would be attached to that normally if you had a printer. And around the back we have the card edge for the floppy disk. I've also got some DIN plugs for a second tape recorder if one was to be used. That ribbon cable that you can see has come from the RS-232 port in the front, and it terminates with a DB25 connector. And these three cords, one of them goes to the power plug in the console, that's the grey cord, and the other two are wrapped together and they go to the power socket in the wall. Now I say wrapped together because there's actually two leads that come into the TRS-80 Model 1 expansion unit, because there are two power packs inside it, and you can see them there lined up. One for the expansion unit board itself, and the other one with the grey cord going from it to the console. It's a rather weird design, but then again I guess it was relatively cheap because you didn't have to design or produce a power pack specifically for the expansion unit itself. You just used a couple of ones that were suitable for the console. The bank of ICs in the middle there, some of them with gold tops, they're the RAM expansion. And there you can see the RS-232 or serial board. These didn't come standard in the expansion unit, you had to buy them as an optional extra. Here's our disk capable system all ready to go. The disk drive does not match the colour scheme, as you can see. It's one I borrowed from my Dick Smith System 80, but in the day these used exactly the same type of drives, except it would have had a cover painted in Battleship Grey to match the TRS-80, and would have probably been in a vertical orientation. Now, one of the problems with a machine that is expanded in this way is that there's a lot to turn on. So you've got to turn on all the peripherals first, finally the expansion unit, and then finally the console. We'll just shove our boot drive in there and throw the power. This springs into life, loads up the operating system, which in this case is Tristos, which was the default operating system for the TRS-80 Model 1, at least one that was disk-based. So version 2.3. Tristos was a reasonable DOS, but it was pretty bare bones, and people soon ditched it for other DOSes that came out for the Model 1, and my favourite is this one. It's New DOS. There were others too, like LDOS, Multi-DOS, DOS Plus, just to name a few. So let's see what's on this New DOS disk, and you can see there the files that came with the operating system. These are utility programs you could use for doing various things. One of the great things about UDOS is that it could support a variety of different drives. Now let me explain why this is important. Back in the day when these models were around, late 1970s, early 80s, drive technology was developing extremely fast, and so with a unit like this you could have a number of different drives attached. You could have double-sided, double density drives, single-sided, 40-track, 80-track. These P drive settings allowed you to cope with all of those. I can't resist showing off this game, Meteor Mission 2, which is one of my favourites on the Model 1. I've actually got some game videos up on my channel, so the very first videos I did for YouTube were of TRS-80 Model 1 games, so check those out. They've got all of my favourites there, recorded from an emulator, so you can see what the gameplay was like. Very playable and entertaining games. Oops. This was another favourite game of mine. This one's called Penetrator. It's a name you probably couldn't get away with today, but you had to fly your ship through various tunnels and caverns and shoot radar installations and drop bombs, avoid missiles. Very entertaining. Here's another game. This is Defense Command. If you listen carefully, you can hear it has a voice. And this is one point I want to make about this machine. The TRS-80 Model 1 has no sound card. So all of the sounds that you can hear are all generated in software. Now that is hard enough, but we're talking about games that were probably no bigger than, say, 16K in size. So programmers had to cope with the graphics, the gameplay, and the sound, all in a tiny amount of memory. When the Model 1 was first sold, it was never claimed to have sound, but programmers discovered that they could use the cassette output to produce various waves and essentially give sound capability to the computer. But it is quite remarkable. If you listen to Frogger here, that's textured sound, that's quite complex, and we're talking about a game that's only about 16K in size, running on a machine that's 1.7 megahertz, a Z80 processor with no hardware assistance whatsoever. It's all done in software. Quite remarkable. So I take my hat off to those early programmers. I think programmers today could probably learn a lot from them. So here's Frogger. We cross the road as we normally do with this game. It's another one I used to play relatively frequently. I could never understand though how the frog could get killed if it fell in the water. I mean, it's a frog, right? Text-based adventure games, in particular the Scott Adams series, were favourites of mine. And this is Pirate Adventure, one of his early ones. But again, one of the features of the Model 1 compared to, say, the Apple II and, or at least the unamended Apple II and the Commodore PET, was that it had reasonable screen real estate. So you could get 64 characters across the screen and 16 line downs, which for things like text-based adventure games like Scott Adams and ones like Zork, which we're booting up here, it meant that you had that screen real estate to play around with. You weren't crammed up, you just have a small window of text to read. It was quite usable, and it really made it quite usable for business applications. So here's VisiCalc, for example, which was one of the business packages that you could get for the Model 1. Again, the screen real estate was reasonable. Now with the Apple II, of course, you could also get extra screen real estate with something like an 80 column card, but that was an extra. You had to buy that. Quite a few word processors came out for the Model 1, and this is the one from Tandy. This is Scriptsit. They had it in both a disc and a cassette version. It was okay, but there were better word processors around. Another early one was Electric Pencil. It's one I'm not that familiar with. That was also available. The one that I'm most familiar with, and the one that I think is really packed with features, is this one here. This is Lazy Writer. And it sort of has two modes. It has a text entry and an edit mode. But I found that a very powerful word processor indeed. Lazy Writer is written by David Walsh, and him and his wife have also written a book called Priming the Pump. This came out a few years ago, and it details the history of the TRS-80 Model 1 and also some of his own experiences of the culture of the day and the software business of those times. It's a really interesting read. Now you might wonder why we've got some assembly language on the screen there, but one of the points I wanted to make was that as well as game playing and business uses, the TRS-80 and a lot of early computers of the time taught people to program. They taught them BASIC, they taught them assembly code. These machines then had quite a creative and educational use. Here's the manual that users would have got with their shiny brand new TRS-80 Model 1. This is the Level 1 manual, and Tandy contracted David Lean to write this. And David used a light, whimsical, non-threatening style, using this character here to illustrate various points. Some have said this approach was a little condescending, but I don't agree with that point of view. I think it was exactly the right approach for the times, because you've got to think, in those days computers were brand new, and to some people, particularly adults, and it was usually adults that could afford computers, they were intimidating. Nobody was quite sure what to do with this thing that was sitting in front of you blinking, waiting for you to issue commands. It didn't want to look silly or appear foolish, and they could be a little scary to use, so I think this was the right approach. Now, Learning Level 1 was followed up with Learning Level 2, also by David, and it just picks up really from where the Level 1 manual leaves off. And in fact, it assumes that you've got the Level 1 manual. And so the first part of the book, first chapter, is devoted to changes to that, how this manual is updating that manual. And there's even an appendix at the back that you can cut out and stick bits and pieces of text over the old Level 1 manual to update it to Level 2. Again, it uses the same approach as the Level 1 manual. You can see that appendix there sticking out. I've cut it from the book, so it's a loose leaf form. Same sort of whimsy. It has cartoons all the way through it to lighten the load, and just sets out chapter by chapter some of the basic elements of basic programming language. We've also got this Level 2 Basic Reference Manual. This is a Tandy document. And I also have this Level 3 Basic Manual from Microsoft. Level 3 Basic is a cassette BASIC that you loaded into your machine to give the inbuilt BASIC some of the extended features that disk BASIC had. And speaking of disks, here's a manual for an editor assembler. And this manual and the software taught you and allowed you to program in an assembly language. It was quite common to do so because assembly language was much quicker than BASIC, and particularly if you wanted to do some fancy gaming, that was the way to go. It was much faster than assembler, and you could squeeze everything into the small amount of RAM that was there. My first machine was a TRS-80 Model 1 clone, the Dixma System 80. Consequently, I've got a lot of literature to do with the TRS-80 and TRS-80 culture. So here's just some of them. And some of the old-timers like me that cut their teeth on the TRS-80 Model 1 will recognise some of these books because they were standard texts of the day. And speaking of culture, one of the features of early microcomputing this is something that younger people perhaps are not aware of, is that you had this huge supporting network of magazines, of user groups, of other things that help support the hobby. There was no internet those days, so if you wanted extra information or to get to know people who had similar machines, you normally joined a user group or you bought lots of magazines like this one, 80 Micro. This is a Wayne Green magazine. Wayne Green passed away in September this year, 2013. And he put out a series of magazines. This was one of them. And 80 Micro was just packed full of tips, tricks, articles, informations, advertisements, great stuff to support the hobby. So I used to look forward to getting one of these every month. They came out monthly. This is the December 1983 edition. Really good source of information, and it just helped you learn about your machine. It helped keep the hobby alive. It helped you connect with other people. They were a great resource. Of course, these days we've got the web, we've got the internet, so they're certainly not that important. But they played a very pivotal role in the enjoyment of your machine and your hobby back in those early days. Well, they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and we had a local magazine down under called Micro 80, which supported the TRS-80 Model 1, 3 and the System 80. And this Australian magazine also sold here in New Zealand. Certainly not as thick as 80 Micro, but it was local. It contained, again, tricks, techniques, came with listings of programs that you could type in, both in basic and machine code, some hardware mods, letters to the editor, gossip as to what was happening in the TRS-80 world. So it was good stuff. I used to look forward to one as well. So you could see some program listings there. First in basic, and this one here is in hex. How we ever got the time to type all those things in, I'll never know. So my final words about the TRS-80 Model 1. Well, it's a machine that history has almost forgotten. And yet, as you saw from those stats, it was one that was very popular in the late 1970s, up to 1980. It perhaps doesn't have the aesthetics of the Apple II and the Commodore PET. And it can be considered a little clunky, the fact that you've got all these cables and cords and other things that need to be fitted together. But you've got to think that the Model 1 was really the first iteration, at least from Tandy's point of view. They came out in 1981 with a Model 3, which fixed those initial design deficiencies. The fact that it was cheap, you could get hold of it easily. You could go into any Radio Shack store and buy this thing over the counter. It had lots of software for it. There was a big support network around it. There were magazines you could read to show you how to use the machine. It was very much like the Model T of early microcomputing. A simple machine which did have its faults, but was one that the every man and every woman could easily obtain, get access to, play with, learn to program, be exposed to the world of microcomputers. And that really is its legacy. As I said, a lot of IT professionals, people that went into the IT industry in the 1980s, many of them cut their teeth on the TRS-80 Model 1. So I'm certainly glad I've got one in my collection.
Well, for those of you that weren't familiar with the TRS-80 Model 1, I hope you enjoyed learning a little about it. And for those of you that saw my first effort, I hope you agree that this video is better. So until next time, keep well, and we'll see you in the next video.